Chapter 5, Section 4, Debates and Extensions. In this section, we will participate in two leading debates concerning international trade. International trade has substantial mismatch between theories and realities. This section highlights two leading debates. First, the debate of trade deficit versus surplus, and second, classical theories versus new realities. Let's take a look at trade deficit versus trade surplus. Smith and Ricardo would probably turn in their graves if they heard that one of today's hottest trade debates still echoes the old debate between mercantilists and free traders 200 years ago. Nowhere is the debate more ferocious than in the U.S., which runs the world's largest trade deficit. In 2006, it reached a record-breaking $760 billion. Thanks to reduced U.S. consumption due to the Great Recession and beefed up export efforts, the U.S. trade deficit was only $560 billion in 2011. Should this level of trade deficit be of concern? Armed with classical theories, free traders argue that this is not a grave concern. They argue that the U.S. and its trading partners mutually benefit by developing a deeper division of labor based on comparative advantage. Former Secretary of the Treasury Paul O'Neill went so far as to say that trade deficit was an antiquated theoretical construct. Paul Krugman, the '08 Nobel laureate in economics, argued, international trade is not about competition. It is about mutually beneficial exchange. Imports, not exports, are the purpose of trade. That is, what a country gains from trade is the ability to import things it wants. Exports are not an objective in and of themselves. The need to export is a burden that a country must bear because its import suppliers are crass enough to demand payment. Critics strongly disagree. They argue that international trade is about competition, about markets, about jobs and incomes. In 2009, President Obama announced the goal of doubling U.S. exports within the next 5 years. Highlighting the importance of exports, Boeing CEO Jim McNerney said, "Every time a Boeing 777 lands in China, it lands with about 4 million parts, reflecting the workmanship of some 11,000 small, medium, and large suppliers." Trade deficit has always been blamed on a particular country with which the U.S. runs the largest deficit, such as Japan in the 80s. Because the U.S. trade deficit with China reached $296 billion in 2011, which was over half of the total deficit, the recent trade deficit debate is otherwise known as the China trade debate. While the U.S. runs trade deficits with all of its major trading partners, Canada, the EU, Japan, and Mexico, and is in trade disputes with them most of the time, the China trade debate is by far the most emotionally charged and politically explosive. Here are some of the points of the debate. For those who think that the trade deficit with China is a huge problem, when it comes to thinking naive trader versus unfair protectionist in China, the U.S. thinks it's a naive trader with open markets. China has unfairly protected its markets. For those who think it's not a big problem, they think that China's markets are already unusually open. Its trade volume is 75% of their gross domestic product, which is in reality only 25% of the U.S. volume. When some talk about greedy exporters, the ones that are concerned say that unscrupulous Chinese exporters are eager to gut out U.S. manufacturing jobs and drive U.S. rivals out of business. For those who think this is not a huge problem, eager foreign investors, they say that 2/3 of Chinese exports are generated by foreign invested firms in China, and that numerous U.S. firms have invested in and benefited from such operations in China. So what is the big deal? Then those who are against say, oh, the demon who has caused deflation. They say that cheap imports sold at the China price push down prices and cause deflation. Then those who are for it say, well, thank China and perhaps Walmart for low prices. Every consumer benefits from cheap prices brought from China by U.S. firms such as Walmart. Another argument, intellectual property. China is an intellectual property violator. U.S. firms lose about $2 billion a year to those claims. Well, what do the supporters say? First of all, it's true, but the US did that in the 19th century, and IP protection will improve in China eventually. For those who say that currency manipulator, that's the problem. Well, the yuan is severely undervalued, maybe up to 40% of its value, giving Chinese exports an unfair advantage in being priced at an artificially low level. So in reality, it's not a low level because the yuan is in itself devalued. Well, for those who don't care, currency issue is not relevant because, yeah, the yuan is somewhat undervalued, but US and other foreign firms producing in China benefit, and the yuan appreciation will not eradicate the US trade deficit. So, no matter what the value of the yuan is, it will never make up the deficit that the US is already suffering. For those who argue that trade deficit will make the US poorer, well, here's the point. Since imports have to be paid, the US borrows against its future with disastrous outcomes, where others say, trade deficits does not cause a fall in the US standard of living. As long as the Chinese are willing to invest in the US economy, what's the worry? The other viewpoint, something has to be done. If the Chinese don't do it our way, the US should introduce drastic measures, such as slapping a 20 to 30% tariffs on all Chinese imports. Now, here's the other argument. Remember the gains from trade argued by classic theories? Tariffs will not bring back US jobs, which will simply go to Mexico or Malaysia, and will lead to retaliation from China, a major importer of US goods and services, so we would lose on that end. Classical theories versus new realities. While the first debate, mostly on China, is primarily about merchandise trade and unskilled manufacturing jobs that classical theories talk about, the second debate, mostly on India, is about service trade and high-skilled jobs in high technology, such as IT. Typically dealing with wheat from Australia to Britain on a slow boat, classical theories certainly could not have dreamed about using the internet to send this manuscript to India to be typeset and counted as India's service exports. In addition to the traditional label of trade in services, a new jargon is trade in tasks. We already discussed a part of this debate in Chapter 4 when focusing on outsourcing. What debate deals with firm-level capabilities, here let us examine country-level and individual-level ramifications. Classical theorists and their modern-day disciples argued that the US and India trade by tapping into each other's comparative advantage. India leverages its abundant high skill and low wage labor. Americans will channel their energy and resources to higher skill, higher paying jobs. While regrettably certain Americans will lose jobs, the nation as a whole benefits, so the theory goes. But not so fast, argued retired MIT economics professor Paul Samuelson. In an influential 2004 paper, Samuelson suggested that in a more realistic world, India can innovate in areas that the US traditionally enjoys comparative advantage, such as IT. Indian innovation can reduce the price of US software exports and curtail the wage of American IT workers. Despite the availability of cheaper goods, which is a plus, the net effect may be that the US is worse off as a whole. Samuelson is not an anti-globalization ideologue. Instead, he won a Nobel Prize for his penetrating research on the gains from international trade. And his mainstream economics textbook has trained generations of students, including your author. Now, even Samuelson is not so sure about one of the founding pillars of modern economics, comparative advantage. The reaction has been swift. Within the same year, Jagdish Bhagwati, an Indian-born Columbia University trade expert, and his colleagues counter Samuelson by arguing that classical pro-free trade theories still hold. Bhagwati and colleagues wrote, "Imagine that you are exporting aircraft, and new producers of aircraft emerge abroad. That will lower the price of your aircraft, and your gains from trade will diminish. You have to be naive to believe that this can never happen. But you have to be even more naive to think that the policy response to the reduced gains from trade is to give up the remaining gains as well. The critical policy question we must address is when external developments such as the growth of skills in China and India, for instance, do diminish the gains from trade to the US, is the harm to the US going to be reduced or increased if the US turns into Fortress America? The answer is the US would only increase its anguish if it closes its markets. In any case, according to Bhagwati and colleagues, the threat posed by Indian innovation is vastly exaggerated and offshoring is too small to matter much. Although approximately 3.4 million US jobs may be outsourced by 2015, we have to realize that in any given year, the US economy destroys 30 million jobs and creates nearly the same, thus dwarfing the effect of offshoring. Further, Bhagwati argues that newer and higher level jobs will replace those lost to offshoring. One huge problem in the middle of the jobless recovery from the Great Recession is this: will there be enough of such jobs in the US? Chapter 5, Section 5, Management Savvy. The learning objective for this section is to draw implications for action. How does this chapter answer the big question in global business, adapted for the context of international trade? What determines the success and failure of firms' exports around the globe? The two core perspectives lead to two answers. Fundamentally, the various economic theories underpin the resource-based view, suggesting that successful exports are valuable, unique, and hard to imitate products generated by certain firms from a nation. However, the political realities stress the explanatory and predictive power of the institution-based view. As rules of the game, institutions such as laws and regulations promoted by various special interest groups can protect certain domestic industries, firms, and individuals, erect trade barriers, and make the nation as a whole worse off. Three implications for action emerge, and we will take a look at Table 5.6. First of all, location, location, location. In international trade, savvy managers' job number one is to leverage comparative advantage of world-class locations. For example, one crucial reason behind China's rise as the world's top exporting nation is that many non-Chinese managers at non-Chinese firms have discovered China's comparative advantage as a low-cost production location. As a result, they set up factories and export from China. 2/3 of Chinese exports are generated by such foreign invested firms. Second, comparative advantage is not fixed. Managers need to constantly monitor and nurture the current comparative advantage of a location and take advantage of new promising locations. Managers who fail to realize the departure of comparative advantage from certain locations are likely to fall behind. For example, numerous German managers have moved productions elsewhere, citing Germany's relatively reduced comparative advantage in basic manufacturing. However, they still concentrate top-notch, high-end manufacturing in Germany, leveraging its excellence in engineering. Third, managers need to be politically active if they appreciate the gains from trade. In times of economic difficulties, governments are often under pressure to adopt protectionist policies. While managers at many uncompetitive firms have long mastered the game of twisting politicians' arm for more protection, managers at competitive firms, who tend to be pro-free trade, have a tendency to shy away from politics. They often fail to realize that free trade is not free. It requires constant efforts and sacrifices to demonstrate, safeguard, and advance the gains from such trade. For example, the U.S.-China Business Council, a pro-free trade, in particular pro-China trade, group consisting of 250 large U.S. firms that are active in China, like Coca-Cola and GE, has stood up and spoken out against various what we call China bashers.